Welcome to Mystery Unlocked, where every story unlocks a new mystery waiting to be unraveled. Grab your favorite cup of coffee, settle in, and prepare to dive into a world full of twists, turns, and unexpected secrets. Stay curious and share the thrill with fellow mystery lovers. Let the adventure begin. Chapter 1: The House of No Returnaliener. Ainsley pressed her fingertips against the aged wood of the library shelf, her breath steady but her heart racing. The hollow knock confirmed what she had suspected. There was a hidden compartment behind the books. With a determined tug, she pried open the loose panel, revealing a dust-laden cavity. Inside, wrapped in a brittle cloth, lay an old, leather-bound diary. She turned it over in her hands, the faded ink barely visible on the cracked spine. The name on the front read, Reginald Wainwright, 1897. Well, she murmured, pulling up a chair by the dim candlelight. The village had long whispered about Ravenscroft Manor, how no one who lived there ever remained for long, how strange deaths had plagued its owners. Eleanor had scoffed at their warnings, dismissing them as the superstitious fears of simple country folk. But now, with the diary trembling in her grasp, she hesitated. She flipped it open. The first pages were mundane business dealings, social engagements, but, as she read further, the tone darkened. I hear them at night, the whispers, they grow louder. Sarah swears she saw a figure outside the window, though no footprints were found in the snow. The feeling of being watched unrelenting. The house is not empty, even when I am alone. Eleanor frowned, her thumb lingering on a smudged sentence. A fresh chill crept up her spine. Whispers, footsteps, the feeling of being watched. She turned another page. The ink was bolder now, the writer's hand more erratic. I cannot bear it. I see it now, the thing in the shadows. I know what it wants. The final entry was written in jagged, uneven strokes. I am not mad if I do not survive the night. No, it was not natural. It was not an accident. Do not let it happen again. The air in the study seemed to tighten around her. Eleanor swallowed hard and forced herself to laugh. Nonsense, she said aloud, closing the book with a snap, but the words echoed in her mind. Do not let it happen again. She placed the diary on her desk, rubbing her temples. Outside the wind howled, rattling the window panes. She glanced towards the door of the study, suddenly alert. Had she locked it? A sound, soft, almost imperceptible, whispered from the hallway. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, moving towards her study. She shot up, knocking her chair back. Who's there? Her voice was steady, though her fingers trembled as she reached for the lamp. The flame flickered as the wind slipped through the cracks in the house. Silence. She exhaled sharply. It's this wretched house, she muttered. Too many tales. Shaking her head, she turned back to her desk and pulled a sheet of paper towards her. She had to write this down to tell someone what she had found. She dipped her pen in ink and wrote 2 words before the lamp flickered violently. A sudden gust extinguished the flame. The room plunged into darkness. She gasped, her chair scraping against the floor as she stood. And then just beyond the door she heard it again. A whisper, not the wind, not the house settling. A whisper. And this time, it spoke her name. Eleanor Ainsley did not scream, but when morning came, she was found dead in her study, her body slumped in the chair, her face frozen in terror. Chapter 2. Death in the study. Morning air was crisp, but a strange hush had settled over Ravenscroft Manor. A few villagers had gathered outside the estate, whispering among themselves, their eyes darting toward the windows as if expecting something or someone to peer back. Inside, Inspector Harold Finch stood with his arms folded, his mouth set in a grim line. He had seen many deaths in his years with the police, but there was something unsettling about Eleanor Ainsley's body, slumped over the desk. Her face contorted in a silent scream. Heart attack, no doubt, muttered Dr. Oliver Greenway, the village physician, as he leaned over the body. Happens more often than you'd think. Sudden fright, weak heart. It doesn't take much. Miss Jane Marple, standing just beyond the threshold, observed the room with quiet intensity. She had arrived in the village only the day before, visiting an old acquaintance, when she heard the news of Eleanor's sudden death. The moment she saw the study, she knew something was terribly wrong. A heart attack, indeed. But what had frightened Eleanor so terribly? She stepped forward. Excuse me, Inspector, might I have a word? Finch sighed. Miss Marple, is it? He gave her a quick glance, recognizing the familiar twinkle in her sharp blue eyes. He had heard of her before. A harmless old lady, they said, with an unfortunate knack for poking her nose. where it didn't belong. If you must. Miss Marple moved closer to the desk, carefully observing Eleanor's surroundings. The room was untouched, no signs of forced entry, no struggle. But her eyes lingered on the overturned teacup by Eleanor's right hand. How curious, she murmured. Finch raised an eyebrow. What is? Miss Marple pointed. The teacup. If Miss Ainsley had been in distress, wouldn't one expect the liquid to have spilled? Dr. Greenway frowned. Well, it could have been empty when she knocked it over. Miss Marple shook her head. Perhaps, but that would be unusual. If she had finished her tea, why would the cup be in her grasp at all? Finch exhaled. Already impatient. You're suggesting someone arranged the scene. Miss Marple smiled politely. I am only suggesting that things are rarely as simple as they seem. A quiet cough interrupted them. Agnes Willoughby, Eleanor's housekeeper, stood near the doorway, wringing her hands in distress. I don't know what happened, she stammered. She was fine last night, a little troubled, perhaps, but she said she was retiring early. Miss Marple turned her attention to the woman. Troubled? In what way? Agnes hesitated. She found something. A book. She kept saying it explained everything about this house, but she wouldn't say what it was. A book? Finch asked. Where is it now? Agnes pointed to the desk. There, sir. That diary. Miss Marple moved swiftly, picking up the leather-bound volume. The name Reginald Wainwright was faintly visible on the cover. She opened it and scanned the first few pages, her expression unreadable. Do you know what it contains? She asked gently. Agnes shook her head, looking pale. She only read it last night. Said it spoke of terrible things. Finch took the book from Miss Marple and flipped through the pages. More village superstitions, I suppose, he muttered. You country folk love your ghost stories. Miss Marple was about to respond when a soft rustling sound caught her attention. She turned to see a torn scrap of paper clutched in Eleanor's stiff fingers. Without hesitation, she carefully pried it loose. The ink was smudged, but a few letters remained legible. Gar. She frowned, turning the scrap in her hand. What had Eleanor been trying to write? Finch barely glanced at it. Meaningless scribbles, probably an unfinished note. Miss Marple said nothing, tucking the paper into her palm. Scribbles, indeed. And yet, it was the only message Eleanor had left behind. Just then, the front door swung open with a sharp creak. A tall man in his mid-30s strode in, his eyes flashing with barely concealed anger. What the devil is going on here? Miss Marple recognized him at once from the family resemblance. Arthur Ellsworth, Eleanor's nephew. I came as soon as I heard, he continued, his voice tight with controlled fury. What happened to my Aunt? Finch stepped forward. I was about to ask you the same. You're her closest relative, are you not? Arthur's jaw tightened. Not by choice, he muttered. I told her not to move here. I warned her, but she wouldn't listen. Miss Marple studied him. There was genuine grief beneath his anger, but something else as well. Guilt, resentment. Arthur moved toward Eleanor's desk, his gaze sweeping the room before landing on the diary. What's that? Finch hesitated before handing it over. It seems your aunt was rather interested in the house's history. Arthur's fingers clenched around the book. Of course she was, he said bitterly. And now she's dead. Silence hung heavy in the room. At last, Finch exhaled and turned to Dr. Greenway. Cause of death, the doctor hesitated. Officially, heart failure. Miss Marple's eyes flickered. Officially and unofficially, Arthur scoffed. No, that's not it. His voice was cold now, steady. She wasn't ill, she wasn't weak. His hand tightened around the diary. Something killed her. Finch shot him a sharp look. Are you suggesting murder? Arthur's jaw worked. I'm saying she didn't just die. Miss Marple watched the exchange, saying nothing. She had already come to the same conclusion. Finch sighed and rubbed his temples. Look, I'll be filing this as natural causes, unless something concrete comes up, but I'll keep an open mind. Miss Marple smiled faintly. That's all one can ask, Inspector. As the others left the study, Miss Marple lingered a moment longer, her fingers grazing the torn scrap of paper. Gar. A name, perhaps. A place. A warning. She glanced once more at Eleanor's frozen expression of terror. Something had frightened her to death, and Miss Marple intended to find out exactly what. Before we continue, we'd love to know where you're watching us from. Drop your city and country in the comments below. Chapter 3. The house, remembers Miss Marple, sat in the dimly lit parlor of Ravenscroft Manor, her hands folded neatly in her lap. The house had a peculiar stillness to it, as though it were holding its breath. Eleanor Ainsley's death lingered in the air, unspoken but undeniable. Across from her, Agnes Willoughby twisted her apron nervously, her thin frame nearly swallowed by the hubocked armchair. The housekeeper's face was pale, her eyes darting to the shadows beyond the flickering oil lamp. "You said Miss Ainsley found something before she died," Miss Marple prompted gently. "Something that troubled her." Agnes swallowed. "The diary," she whispered. "She found it in the study last night. She read it for hours. She was frightened." Miss Marple tilted her head. "Frightened of what?" Agnes hesitated, then lowered her voice as though afraid the house itself might hear. "She said the house was cursed, that the deaths weren't accidents, that something unnatural was at work." Miss Marple's fingers tightened slightly over her handbag. "And do you believe that, Agnes?" Agnes flinched. "I don't know what to believe, ma'am. I only know that she was alive when I left her study, and by morning, she was." Her voice caught. Miss Marple let the silence settle before continuing. "This house has seen tragedy before, hasn't it?" Agnes shuddered. "Aye, ever since Reginald Wainwright. They say he went mad, but others." She trailed off. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "It does seem rather a pattern, doesn't it?" The heavy front door creaked open, sending a gust of wind through the room. Both women started as Arthur Ellsworth stepped inside, his face set in a dark scowl. He barely acknowledged them as he marched toward the study. Miss Marple turned to Agnes. "Has Mr. Ellsworth been staying here?" Agnes shook her head. "No, ma'am. He's been away for months. Barely visited Miss Ainsley at all." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. "And yet he arrived rather quickly this morning." Agnes shifted uncomfortably. "He and Miss Ainsley didn't part on the best of terms. There were disagreements about the house. Disagreements. She wanted to stay. He wanted her to sell." Agnes lowered her voice, said it was dangerous. Miss Marple absorbed this quietly. Arthur's arrival, his immediate fixation on the diary, his declaration that his aunt hadn't just died, all of it suggested he knew more than he was letting on. Just then, raised voices drifted in from the study. Miss Marple excused herself and made her way down the corridor, her steps light and deliberate. She stopped just outside the study door, listening. "Don't care what it says." Arthur's voice was sharp, laced with frustration. "She was obsessed with this house, and now she's dead." A second voice, "Inspector Finch. Destroying the diary won't change that, Ellsworth." There was a heavy thud, as though something had been slammed onto the desk. "You don't understand," Arthur said through gritted teeth. "This house, it doesn't let go." Miss Marple took this as her cue and stepped inside, her expression pleasant, but her eyes keen. "Forgive me for interrupting, gentlemen," she said, "but I do believe we are all after the same truth." Arthur turned to her, his jaw tight. "Truth? There is no truth, Miss Marple. There's only the past repeating itself." Finch scoffed. "I suppose you think the house killed her, then?" Arthur's lips pressed into a thin line. He said nothing. Miss Marple moved closer to the desk, where the diary lay open. "Mr. Ellsworth, you arrived this morning, in a great hurry. Might I ask, who informed you of your aunt's passing?" Arthur hesitated. "No one." Inspector Finch frowned. "What?" Arthur exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "I had a telegram from her yesterday afternoon. She said she'd found something. She wanted to meet." His voice dropped. "But by the time I got here, she was already dead." Miss Marple studied him carefully. What had she found? Arthur's hands clenched. "This," he gestured toward the diary. "She believed it explained the deaths in this house. She thought it proved something." Finch grunted. "A lot of dramatic nonsense, if you ask me." Miss Marple, however, was more interested in something else. "Mr. Ellsworth, before she died, Miss Ainsley attempted to leave a message." Arthur's brow furrowed. "What?" Miss Marple pulled the torn scrap of paper from her pocket. "She was writing something when she collapsed." This was found in her hand. She held it out. "It appears to be the beginning of a word, GAR." Arthur's face drained of color. Miss Marple didn't miss the reaction. "Does that mean something to you?" Arthur shook his head quickly. "No, nothing." Finch sighed. "Miss Marple, this is all very fascinating, but there's no evidence of a crime, no sign of foul play, just an old woman who got herself worked up over ghost stories and died of fright." Miss Marple gave a small, knowing smile. "The trouble, Inspector, is that fright is not so easily manufactured. One must ask why was she so afraid." Finch waved a dismissive hand. She read something disturbing and let her imagination run wild. Miss Marple's gaze did not waver. Or she saw something. Arthur stiffened. Finch threw up his hands. Unless you can produce a suspect, Miss Marple, I'm treating this as natural causes. Miss Marple sighed. Very well, Inspector. But her mind was already working. She turned to Arthur. You'll be staying at the house, I presume. Arthur hesitated. Yes, at least for a few nights. Miss Marple nodded. Then I wonder might I borrow the diary for a short while. I should like to read it. Arthur hesitated. Then, surprising them all, he pushed the book toward her. Do what you like, he muttered. It won't change anything. Miss Marple slipped the diary into her handbag. That remains to be seen. Mr. Ellsworth, as she left the study, she glanced once more at the scrap of paper in her palm. G.A.R. A clue left by a dying woman. Miss Marple had solved many mysteries before, and she had no doubt this one was only just beginning. Chapter 4. Secrets in the Diary. Miss Marple sat in the quiet parlor of her lodgings at the Bluebell Inn, the village's modest but comfortable guest house. The diary of Reginald Wainwright lay open on the small table before her, its cracked leather binding fragile with age. A pot of tea steamed gently beside it, but she had yet to take a sip. Her keen blue eyes were fixed on the spidery handwriting that covered the yellowed pages. The first few entries were mundane daily affairs, financial matters, but as she read on, the tone changed. The house watches me. Miss Marple's fingers tightened slightly over the page. Sarah is frightened. She begs me to leave. But where would we go? Ravenscroft is our home. Last night, I heard a voice, not Sarah's, not my own. The entries became increasingly erratic. Miss Marple could almost hear the desperation in Wainwright's words. I wake in the dark, certain someone is standing at the foot of my bed. Sarah swears she saw a shadow pass through the corridor, but the doors were locked. I feel it now, always watching, waiting. And then, the final entry, scrawled in shaky, uneven strokes. I am not mad. If I do not survive the night, know this: it was not natural. It was not an accident. Do not let it happen again. Miss Marple let out a slow breath. Eleanor Ainsley had read these very words just before her death. Had they terrified her? Or had she recognized something in them, something that connected to her own fate? A gentle knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Come in, she called. The door opened, and Agnes Willoughby stepped inside, twisting her hands in her apron, begging, Your pardon, Miss Marple. I thought you'd want to know Arthur Ellsworth is leaving the house. Miss Marple closed the diary with a thoughtful expression. Oh, so soon? Agnes nodded. He's packed a bag and said he's going back to London. Said there's nothing left for him here. Miss Marple picked up her tea and took a measured sip. And yet, last night, he was quite insistent that his aunt's death was unnatural. Agnes hesitated. Maybe he's afraid, miss. That house, she shuddered. I wouldn't stay there, not for all the money in the world. Miss Marple's eyes flickered with interest. Tell me, Agnes, did Miss Ainsley ever mention the name Gar to you? Agnes frowned. Gar. Miss Marple retrieved the torn scrap of paper from her handbag. She was writing something when she died. All we have is this. G.A.R. Agnes's brow creased in thought. Then, suddenly, her face paled. Good Lord, she whispered. Miss Marple set down her teacup. You recognize it? Agnes hesitated, then slowly nodded. Garwood, she murmured. Miss Marple leaned forward. Who is Garwood? Agnes licked her lips, her voice lowering to a near whisper. Michael Garwood. He lived in the village years ago. He was involved with Eleanor Ainsley. Miss Marple's interest sharpened. In what way? Agnes hesitated. They were close once, but something happened between them. He left the village suddenly, without a word. Some say they had a terrible row. Others say he vanished. Miss Marple's fingers tapped lightly against the diary. Vanished. Agnes nodded, disappeared without a trace. One day he was here, the next gone. Miss Marple sat back in her chair, considering this. Could it be that Eleanor had uncovered something about Garwood's disappearance? And if so, had it led to her death? Agnes shifted uncomfortably. I shouldn't be telling you all this, Miss Marple. People don't like talking about the past in this village. Miss Marple gave her a reassuring smile. The past has a way of catching up with us, my dear. Best we understand it before it does. Just then, a commotion from outside drew their attention. Voices, hurried footsteps, something was happening. Miss Marple stood. Shall we see what all the fuss is about? Together, they stepped outside. A small crowd had gathered near the village square, murmuring amongst themselves. At the center of it stood Arthur Ellsworth, his face red with frustration as Inspector Finch blocked his path. "I told you, I have a train to catch," Arthur snapped. Finch crossed his arms. "And I told you no one leaves this village until we get some answers." Arthur's eyes flashed. "Answers? My aunt is dead. There are no answers." Miss Marple approached calmly. "Forgive me, gentlemen, but what seems to be the trouble?" Finch turned to her. "Ellsworth here was in rather a hurry to leave. When I asked him to stay for further questioning, he wasn't exactly cooperative." Arthur exhaled sharply. "Because it's ridiculous. There's nothing more to discuss." Miss Marple regarded him thoughtfully. "You know, Mr. Ellsworth, I quite understand your desire to leave, and yet," she paused, watching his expression carefully, "it is odd, is it not, that Miss Ainsley should attempt to write the name Garwood just before she died?" Arthur's face drained of color. Miss Marple continued, her voice gentle but firm. "It is an unusual name. Would you happen to know why she might have written it?" Arthur's jaw worked, his fingers clenching at his sides. For a moment, it seemed he might deny it, but then, to everyone's surprise, he let out a bitter laugh. "So, she found out," he muttered. Finch's eyes narrowed. "Found out what, exactly?" Arthur's shoulders slumped. "That Michael Garwood didn't just vanish." A hush fell over the crowd. Arthur exhaled. "He died, right there, in Ravenscroft Manor." Miss Marple's gaze remained steady. "And how would you know that, Mr. Ellsworth?" Arthur hesitated. Then, in a low voice, he said, "Because my aunt killed him." A collective gasp rippled through the onlookers. Finch stepped forward. "You'd better explain yourself, Ellsworth." Arthur swallowed hard. "Years ago, when I was a child, my aunt told me a story, a warning." "Really?" "She said that Ravenscroft had a way of keeping secrets, that sometimes it was best to let things be." He let out a shaky breath. "When I got older, I understood. She wasn't talking about ghosts. She was talking about what she had done." Miss Marple's voice was calm. "What had she done, Arthur?" Arthur hesitated, then finally said, "She killed Michael Garwood and hid his body in the house." A stunned silence followed. Miss Marple tilted her head. "And did she tell you why?" Arthur exhaled. "They had a fight, a terrible one. He threatened her, said he would ruin her. She said she acted in self-defense." His voice dropped, "but she never reported it. She never told anyone. She simply hid him." Finch's expression was unreadable. "And you never thought to come forward?" Arthur laughed bitterly. "With what proof?" "A childhood memory. I barely believed it myself." Miss Marple glanced toward Ravenscroft Manor in the distance. The house had kept its secret for years, but now, the past had come calling, and Miss Marple intended to uncover every last truth it had hidden. Chapter 5. The bones beneath the floor of Ellsworth's confession had sent a wave of uneasy silence through the village square. Inspector Finch, his face set in grim determination, wasted no time in marching Arthur back to Ravenscroft Manor. Miss Marple followed closely behind, her usual composed expression betraying a flicker of intense curiosity. If Arthur's words were true, then somewhere within the old house, the remains of Michael Garwood still lay hidden. By the time they reached the manor, the grey sky had darkened, casting long, creeping shadows over the house's facade. Agnes Willoughby stood by the front door, her face pale and drawn as she watched them approach. "What's happened?" she asked in a hushed voice. Finch didn't answer as he pushed open the heavy door and stepped inside. The others followed, their footsteps echoing in the vast, empty hall. The air was thick, as though the house itself was aware of what was about to unfold. Arthur exhaled shakily. "I don't know exactly where she put him," he admitted, "but I remember my aunt saying once that this house had a way of swallowing things." Miss Marple's gaze swept over the grand staircase, the walls lined with dust-laden portraits. "Did she ever mention a specific room?" Arthur hesitated, then murmured, "The study. She always said the study was the heart of the house." Inspector Finch didn't wait for further discussion. "We'll start there." The group moved toward the study, the air growing heavier with each step. Once inside, Finch immediately began inspecting the room, tapping along the walls and floors. Arthur hovered near the desk, his fingers brushing over the worn wooden surface. "She must have buried him," he muttered. "There's no other explanation." Miss Marple, meanwhile, was running her fingers lightly over the edge of the bookshelf. Her sharp eyes caught something peculiar, the faintest gap between the shelves and the wall behind it. "Inspector," she called softly. I wonder if you might have a look at this. Finch stepped over and peered at the shelf. With a firm tug, he tested its stability. To his surprise, the entire structure gave way slightly, as if it had been moved before. There's something behind here, he muttered. He glanced back at Arthur. Help me shift this. Arthur hesitated, then stepped forward. Together, they pulled the bookshelf forward inch by inch, until it revealed a narrow, concealed space. Dust billowed into the air, but what lay within was unmistakable. A skeletal form, crumpled and forgotten, lay slumped against the wall. A collective shudder passed through the group. Agnes let out a strangled gasp, pressing a trembling hand to her mouth. Arthur turned away, looking sickened. Miss Marple, however, simply observed. The bones were long undisturbed, the skull tilted slightly as though the victim had died, slumped in a seated position. And then there was the most telling detail: his hands, or rather, his missing fingers. Miss Marple bent slightly, peering closer. The bones of both hands were incomplete, several fingers seemingly snapped away. Good heavens, she murmured. Finch, recovering from his initial shock, let out a low whistle. Well, there he is, he muttered grimly. Michael Garwood, I presume. Arthur swallowed hard. She never told me she left him like this, he said hoarsely. I thought he broke off, unable to finish. Miss Marple, still gazing at the skeleton, spoke in her gentle but firm manner. I don't believe your aunt told you the full truth, Mr. Ellsworth. Arthur frowned. What do you mean? Miss Marple straightened. I have seen many things in my time, and I dare say I understand the difference between panic and premeditation. She gestured to the body. This was not the act of a frightened woman defending herself. This was methodical. The removal of the finger suggests someone wanted to ensure the victim could not be identified easily. Your aunt did not panic, she planned. Arthur took a shaky step back, looking horrified. No, that can't be true. Miss Marple's gaze remained steady. I'm afraid the evidence suggests otherwise. Finch let out a grunt. We'll need to confirm the identity, but I'd wager you're right, Miss Marple. He turned to Arthur. And if your aunt did kill Garwood, then that leaves us with another question. Arthur hesitated. What question? Miss Marple answered for him. If Eleanor Ainsley had gotten away with murder all these years, then why was she killed now? Silence. Agnes was the first to break it. You think someone killed her to keep this from coming out? Miss Marple's expression was thoughtful. It would seem a reasonable assumption. She looked at Arthur. Your aunt sent you a telegram yesterday, telling you she had found something important. If she had discovered the body or something connected to it, then that would certainly give someone a reason to silence her. Finch rubbed his chin. But who? If she was the only one who knew the truth. Not the only one, Miss Marple corrected. Her gaze shifted toward Arthur. Someone else knew. Arthur looked startled. You think I? Miss Marple shook her head. No, Mr. Ellsworth, I don't believe you killed your aunt, but I do believe there is someone in this village who had a stake in keeping the past buried. Finch exhaled sharply. Well, if that's the case, then we've got a murderer to catch. He glanced at the skeleton once more, and a body to properly identify. Miss Marple nodded. Indeed. The tension in the room was palpable. The past had finally come to light, but with it came an even darker question: who had been willing to kill to keep it hidden? As Finch sent 4 men to retrieve the remains, Miss Marple quietly observed Arthur. His hands were clenched into fists, his jaw tight with distress. You look troubled, Mr. Ellsworth, she remarked softly. Arthur let out a short, bitter laugh. Wouldn't you be, Miss Marple? I came here expecting grief, not this. He gestured to the skeleton. Miss Marple studied him a moment longer. Grief is often complicated, she murmured. And, as we've seen, so is the truth. Arthur didn't reply, as the remains of Michael Garwood were carefully removed from their hidden tomb. Miss Marple's mind was already racing ahead. Eleanor Ainsley had died to keep this secret from surfacing, which meant someone, perhaps someone standing in this very room, had a reason to keep it buried, and they might not be finished yet. Chapter 6. The man who returned at the discovery of Michael Garwood's skeleton had sent a ripple of unease through the village. Word spread fast, as it always did in small places, and by the following morning, Ravenscroft Manor had become the center of a whispered storm. The villagers, who had long treated the house with wary glances and hushed superstitions, now had a tangible reason for their fears. Miss Marple, however, was not a woman to be distracted by rumors. The past had revealed itself, but it was the present that concerned her now. Eleanor Ainsley had been killed, and the revelation of Michael Garwood's fate was unlikely to be a coincidence. Seated in the Bluebell Inn, she stirred her tea thoughtfully as Inspector Finch took the seat opposite her. He looked weary, as if the weight of Ravenscroft's history had settled upon his shoulders. "Well," he said gruffly, "the coroners confirmed that the bones we found belonged to a man in his late 30s, deceased for at least 20 years. We'll need further analysis for absolute certainty, but we can assume it's Garwood." Miss Marple nodded. "And Eleanor Ainsley's cause of death?" Finch exhaled. "Poison, administered in her tea. Slow-acting, but effective." He shook his head. "Someone wanted her dead, Miss Marple, and I'd wager it was because she was on the verge of revealing something." Miss Marple's expression was unreadable. "I am inclined to agree." Finch leaned back in his chair. "That brings us to our suspects." "Arthur Ellsworth," Miss Marple prompted. Finch rubbed his jaw. He had motive, certainly. If he suspected his aunt was about to expose a family scandal, he might have silenced her. Miss Marple sipped her tea. "And yet, he seems genuinely shaken by what he's learned. His reaction last night was not that of a guilty man." Finch grunted. "Perhaps, but we can't rule him out." Miss Marple inclined her head. "What of our other guests at Ravenscroft?" Finch sighed. "Agnes Willoughby swears she saw nothing unusual before Miss Ainsley's death, but she's nervous about something." He hesitated. "And then there's Robert Lockwood." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. "Ah, the solicitor." Finch nodded. "Claims he was in the house at the time of Miss Ainsley's death, but heard nothing suspicious. Yet he was the one handling her affairs. If she planned to change her will, or confess something that might affect her estate, he'd have had reason to intervene." Miss Marple set down her cup. "Then there is also another possibility." Finch looked at her. "Expectantly." Miss Marple folded her hands neatly in her lap. "What if Michael Garwood never truly disappeared?" Finch frowned. "What are you suggesting?" Miss Marple's voice was calm but pointed. "What if Garwood did not die all those years ago? What if someone merely wanted us to think he did?" The inspector blinked. "You believe he could still be alive?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "It would not be the first time a man allowed himself to be presumed dead, Inspector." Before Finch could respond, the door to the inn swung open with force. Agnes Willoughby burst inside, breathless and wild-eyed. "Miss Marple," she gasped. "Inspector, you must come at once." Miss Marple rose immediately. "What has happened?" Agnes's hands trembled as she clutched at the doorframe. "There's a man at the manor. He says his name is Michael Garwood." A hush fell over the inn. Even Finch, usually composed, looked momentarily startled. Miss Marple adjusted her gloves. "Well, now," she murmured. "That is rather interesting." By the time they arrived at Ravenscroft Manor, a small crowd had gathered outside, drawn by this strange announcement. The villagers stood in nervous clusters, murmuring amongst themselves, as they cast wary glances toward the house. Standing in the doorway was a mantle, gaunt, with a face lined by time and hardship. His sharp blue eyes swept over the assembled crowd before resting on Miss Marple and Inspector Finch. "You are the detective, I presume?" he asked, his voice measured. Miss Marple studied him carefully. "And you, sir, claim to be Michael Garwood?" A wry smile touched his lips. "Claim?" He spread his arms. "I am Michael Garwood." Finch stepped forward. "Forgive my skepticism, Mr. Garwood, but you were thought to be dead. We uncovered remains hidden behind the study wall, bones we believed to be yours." Garwood's expression did not change. "Then I suppose you were mistaken." Miss Marple observed him with quiet intensity. "If you are truly Michael Garwood, then perhaps you can explain where you have been all these years." Garwood's eyes darkened. "Away, that is rather vague," Miss Marple said mildly. Garwood let out a short laugh. "What do you want me to say, madame? That I fled the village after a terrible falling out with Eleanor? That I was forced to leave because I knew too much? That I have lived with the knowledge that I was supposed to be dead?" His gaze turned cold. "Would you believe me?" Finch folded his arms. "That depends. Why return now?" Garwood's jaw tightened. "Because Eleanor is dead, and I believe she was murdered." The weight of his words settled over the group. Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. "And how would you know that?" Garwood hesitated. "Because she wrote to me." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Finch narrowed his eyes. "She wrote to you?" Garwood nodded. 2 weeks ago. She said she had something important to tell me, something about the past. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. And did she mention what it was? Garwood shook his head. No, only that she feared for her life. Finch exhaled sharply. And yet, you waited until after her death to return. Garwood's expression was unreadable. I wasn't certain whether it was a trap. Miss Marple studied him carefully. A trap set by whom? Garwood's blue eyes flickered toward the house. Someone who didn't want the truth to be known. A sudden gust of wind rattled the old manor's shutters. The house, once silent in its secrets, now seemed to echo with the ghosts of its past. Miss Marple turned to Finch. I believe, Inspector, that we may need to have a very long conversation with Mr. Garwood. Finch nodded. That, and a closer look at Miss Ainsley's correspondence. Garwood's voice was steady, but there was something unreadable in his gaze. Then I suggest we begin. Miss Marple held his stare for a moment longer. The past had returned, but whether it had come for justice or for something else entirely remained to be seen. Chapter 7. The letter that never arriveth. Air inside Ravenscroft Manor was thick with unspoken tension. Michael Garwood, the man thought to be dead for 25 years, now sat in the study where his supposed remains had been discovered. His sharp blue eyes flickered between Miss Marple and Inspector Finch, but there was something calculated about his composure, as though he were a man accustomed to secrets. Miss Marple, perched in a high-backed chair near the fireplace, observed him keenly. Mr. Garwood, if Eleanor Ainsley truly wrote to you, may I ask why you did not come forward before her death? Garwood folded his hands. As I said, I wasn't sure if I was walking into a trap. Inspector Finch, arms crossed, let out a low grunt, a convenient excuse. Garwood's expression did not change. You think I killed Eleanor, don't you? Finch's jaw tightened. I think it's mighty suspicious that the woman who allegedly invited you back is now dead. Garwood leaned forward slightly. Let me make one thing clear, Inspector. I did not kill Eleanor. But someone in this house, someone in this village, wanted her silenced. And I intend to find out why. Miss Marple studied him with quiet intensity. I find it interesting, Mr. Garwood, that you return only now, just as your name is being whispered again. Garwood gave a small, dry chuckle. I assure you, Miss Marple, I did not plan my reappearance for dramatic effect. He exhaled. But if you're asking why I stayed away all these years, it is because I believed that returning would only stir up trouble. Finch scoffed. And yet, here you are. Garwood's expression hardened. Because Eleanor's letter changed everything. Miss Marple tilted her head. Might we see it? For the first time, hesitation flickered across Garwood's face. I don't have it. Finch's eyes narrowed. What do you mean, you don't have it? Garwood exhaled. Sharply, I never received it. Silence filled the room. Miss Marple, ever composed, spoke gently. Yet, you just said Eleanor wrote to you. She did, Garwood insisted. I was contacted by an acquaintance, someone from London who had been keeping an eye on things here. He told me that Eleanor had written to me, but the letter never arrived. Finch gave him a skeptical look. And you expect us to believe that? Garwood's jaw clenched. Believe what you like, Inspector. But someone intercepted that letter before it reached me. Miss Marple's fingers tapped lightly against the armrest. And you believe that person might be Eleanor's killer? Garwood nodded. It would make sense, wouldn't it? If Eleanor's message never reached me, then someone didn't want me to return. Finch let out a slow breath. So, if we find this letter, we might find our murderer. Miss Marple gave a small smile. Indeed. Miss Marple and Inspector Finch wasted no time in setting their next course of action. While Finch arranged for an official search of Eleanor's personal belongings, Miss Marple decided to take a more subtle approach. The following afternoon, she called upon Agnes Willoughby at the village tea shop. Agnes had always been observant, and if Eleanor had written something important, she might have noticed something unusual. Agnes, pale and fidgeting with her teacup, gave a nervous smile as Miss Marple settled into the seat across from her. I must say, dear, it has been quite an eventful few days, Miss Marple said pleasantly. Agnes let out a shaky laugh. That's putting it mildly. Miss Marple stirred her tea. Tell me, Agnes, in the days before Eleanor's death, did you happen to notice her writing any letters? Agnes blinked. Letters? Yes, my dear, important ones. Ones she might not have wanted anyone else to see. Agnes bit her lip, her fingers gripping the edge of her saucer. I do remember something. Miss Marple's expression remained calm, but her interest sharpened. Go on. Agnes hesitated. 2 weeks ago, I found Eleanor in the study, writing a letter in a terrible hurry. She looked frightened. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. And did she say whom the letter was for? Agnes nodded slowly. She told me it was something she had to send before it was too late. But she wouldn't tell me what it was about. Miss Marple's blue eyes twinkled. And did she post it herself? Agnes hesitated again. No. She asked Robert Lockwood to do it. There was a brief silence. Miss Marple, ever so gently, set down her spoon. Robert Lockwood, the solicitor. Agnes nodded. Yes. Miss Marple's gaze was thoughtful. And did you ever see that letter again? Agnes shook her head. No. But I did notice something odd. A few days later, Robert came back to the manor. He said he needed Eleanor's signature for something. But when he left, Eleanor seemed unsettled. Miss Marple smiled gently. Agnes, my dear, you have been most helpful. Agnes bit her lip. Do you think Robert never sent the letter? Miss Marple's expression was unreadable. I think it would be most interesting to find out. That evening, Miss Marple and Finch called upon Robert Lockwood at his small office in the village. The solicitor greeted them with his usual smooth courtesy, but there was a flicker of unease in his eyes. To what do I owe the pleasure, Miss Marple? Inspector Finch got straight to the point. We need to talk about a letter Eleanor Ainsley wrote before she died. Lockwood frowned. A letter. Miss Marple's smile was polite. Yes, Mr. Lockwood, the one she entrusted to you for posting. For a fraction of a second, Lockwood hesitated. Then he gave a small chuckle. Oh, that. Yes, she did ask me to send a letter, but I don't see how it's relevant. Finch's eyes narrowed. Did you send it? Lockwood gave a tight smile. Of course. Miss Marple tilted her head. And yet, it never reached its intended recipient. The air in the room thickened. Lockwood's fingers drummed lightly against his desk. That's hardly my concern, is it? Once a letter is posted, I have no control over it. Miss Marple observed him carefully. But you do have control over whether it is posted at all. Lockwood's smile faltered. What are you implying? Miss Marple. Finch crossed his arms. She's implying that you never sent the letter. Lockwood's eyes darted between them. This is ridiculous. Miss Marple's voice remained gentle, but firm. Mr. Lockwood, what did Eleanor say in that letter that frightened you? Lockwood stiffened. I have no idea what you're talking about. Miss Marple's gaze did not waver. No. Then tell me, why did Eleanor seem so unsettled after your last visit? Lockwood's mouth opened, then closed. Finch's voice was cold. We'll be having a very thorough look at your records, Mr. Lockwood. Lockwood's knuckles were white against the edge of his desk. Miss Marple gave him a knowing look. You see, Mr. Lockwood, letters, especially the ones that never arrive, can be very revealing. For the first time, Robert Lockwood looked afraid. Chapter 8. The solicitor's secret. Robert Lockwood sat rigidly in his office chair, his face pale under the dim glow of the desk lamp. His fingers drummed against the polished wood, betraying the nervous energy he fought to contain. Miss Marple and Inspector Finch, seated across from him, remained composed. But the silence in the room was heavy. At last, Lockwood exhaled sharply. You're making a grave mistake, he said, his voice strained. I had nothing to do with Eleanor's death. Finch raised an eyebrow. Then, you won't mind answering a few more questions? Lockwood hesitated, then forced a tight smile. Of course not. Miss Marple adjusted her lace gloves and spoke with gentle precision. Mr. Lockwood, let us be clear. Eleanor Ainsley trusted you to send a letter, one we now believe never reached its intended recipient. That raises a rather important question. Why? Lockwood shifted uncomfortably. It was posted, was it? Finch's voice was sharp. Lockwood pressed his lips together, then let out a slow breath. I don't remember. Miss Marple's expression did not change. A rather convenient lapse in memory. Lockwood's jaw clenched. Look, it's possible the letter was misplaced before it left my office. Mistakes happen, Finch scoffed. A mistake, was it? A letter that could have summoned Michael Garwood back before Eleanor was killed. Lockwood swallowed. I didn't even read it. Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. But you knew it was important. Lockwood looked away. Finch's voice was firm. What was in that letter, Lockwood? The solicitor was silent for a long moment. Then, in a hushed tone, he said, something Eleanor had uncovered, something about the past. Miss Marple leaned forward ever so slightly. And you didn't want it uncovered, did you? Lockwood's breath caught. That's not. He stopped himself, rubbing a hand over his face. When he finally spoke again, His voice was quieter. I wasn't the only one who didn't want the past disturbed. Miss Marple exchanged a glance with Finch. You did read it, didn't you? Finch pressed. Lockwood exhaled. Yes, I read it. Miss Marple nodded encouragingly. Then perhaps you should tell us what it said. Lockwood hesitated, but under their combined scrutiny, he relented. Eleanor had found something in the manor, something that proved Michael Garwood was betrayed all those years ago. Miss Marple's voice was soft but insistent. By whom? Lockwood's face was drawn. By someone still alive. A tense silence filled the room. Finch's voice was low. And instead of delivering the letter, you destroyed it. Lockwood swallowed hard. I had to. Miss Marple sighed. I'm afraid that is rather damning, Mr. Lockwood. Lockwood rubbed his temples. You don't understand. If the truth came out, it would ruin everything. Finch's eyes narrowed. Everything for whom? Lockwood hesitated. Miss Marple's voice was almost kind. You were protecting someone, weren't you? Lockwood's face twisted in conflict. His hands gripped the edge of his desk as though steadying himself. Finally, he whispered, yes. Finch leaned in. Who? Lockwood's gaze flickered toward the window, as if afraid someone might be listening. His lips parted then a loud crash shattered the tense moment. The three of them jolted as the office door flew open. A figure stumbled inside Arthur Ellsworth. His face was red with exertion, his breath ragged. You, Arthur gasped, pointing a trembling finger at Lockwood. You knew. Lockwood shot to his feet. Arthur, what are you? Arthur staggered forward. You knew Eleanor had found out the truth, and you kept it from us. Miss Marple remained seated, watching the confrontation unfold with keen eyes. Finch stepped between the two men. Ellsworth, what are you talking about? Arthur's chest heaved. The letter, Eleanor's letter. I found a draft of it, among her old papers. His eyes locked onto Lockwood's. You knew what she was planning to reveal. Lockwood's face drained of color. Miss Marple spoke gently. And what was she planning to reveal? Mr. Ellsworth. Arthur let out a shaky breath. She found proof that Michael Garwood was framed for something he didn't do. Lockwood squeezed his eyes shut. Finch's voice was steely. Framed for what? Arthur swallowed. For the first murder at Ravenscroft Manor. Miss Marple's fingers tightened around the armrest. Go on, Mr. Ellsworth. Arthur looked between them, then said hoarsely, Eleanor had found an old document, something she wasn't supposed to see. It proved that someone else was responsible for the death of Richard Ainsley. Finch's jaw tightened. Eleanor's brother. Arthur nodded. Everyone believed Michael Garwood killed him in a fit of rage. That's why he disappeared. Miss Marple's voice was quiet. But you're saying he didn't? Arthur exhaled. No. And Eleanor was going to expose the truth. Finch turned sharply to Lockwood. And you knew this? Lockwood's hands curled into fists. Yes, but I wasn't the only one. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed with understanding. Then tell us, Mr. Lockwood, who else knew? Lockwood hesitated, then whispered, the real murderer. Silence fell. Miss Marple spoke gently. And that, I suspect, is why Eleanor Ainsley had to die. Finch's voice was grim. Because she was about to name them. Arthur swallowed hard, and the person who killed Eleanor. Miss Marple's voice was soft but sure. Is the same person who killed Richard Ainsley. A heavy stillness settled over the room. Finch squared his shoulders. Then we need to find out who that is. Miss Marple gave a small nod. Yes, and I believe we are very close indeed. Lockwood let out a long, slow breath. You don't understand. Finch turned to him. Then, help us. Lockwood clenched his jaw. Then, finally, he murmured, the murderer is someone you would never suspect. Miss Marple's gaze remained unwavering. Arthur's, the voice was barely a whisper. Then it's someone we trust. A cold breeze rattled the window panes. Miss Marple's voice was quiet, but firm. And that, she said, is what makes them most dangerous of all. Chapter 9. A visitor in the ninth village of Ravenscroft had settled into an uneasy silence by the time Miss Marple returned to her guest house. Though the night was still, a sense of unrest loomed in the air. She could feel it like the weight of unsaid words pressing against the walls of the old manor house where Eleanor Ainsley had met her end. Miss Marple set her handbag down and removed her gloves with deliberate care. The evening's revelations had been most illuminating, yet they left one crucial question unanswered. Who had silenced Eleanor before she could expose the truth? Her mind ticked over the facts. Michael Garwood had been framed. Eleanor had discovered a piece of evidence, one that proved his innocence and, by extension, exposed the true murderer. But that letter had been intercepted, most likely by someone desperate to keep the past buried. And Robert Lockwood, despite his cowardice, had hinted at something vital. The murderer is someone you would never suspect. A gentle knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Miss Marple's brow furrowed. It was rather late for visitors. She moved carefully across the room and opened the door. Agnes Willoughby stood in the dimly lit corridor, wrapped in a thick shawl, her eyes darting nervously down the hall. "Miss Marple," she whispered, "may I come in?" Miss Marple stepped aside without hesitation. Agnes wrung her hands as she sat, her face pale and drawn. "I shouldn't be here," she murmured, "but I had to tell someone." Miss Marple folded her hands neatly in her lap. "Tell me what, my dear?" Agnes hesitated. Then, in a hushed voice, she said, "Someone was in my house tonight." Miss Marple's expression remained calm, but her eyes sharpened. "In your house?" Agnes nodded frantically. "I heard footsteps, soft, careful ones. I live alone, Miss Marple. No one else should have been there." Miss Marple's fingers tightened slightly. "And did you see anyone?" Agnes swallowed. "No, but when I went to check my study, my desk had been disturbed." She let out a shaky breath. "I think someone was searching for something." Miss Marple considered this. "And do you have something worth finding?" Agnes hesitated again. Her hands clenched in her lap. "I think I do." Miss Marple's tone was gentle. "What is it, my dear?" Agnes bit her lip. "It's about Eleanor's letter." A silence fell between them. Miss Marple did not rush her. At last Agnes spoke in a trembling voice. "Eleanor told me something before she died. She said that, if anything happened to her, I should look in her old sewing box." Miss Marple's eyes flickered with understanding. "And did you?" Agnes nodded. "Tonight, and I found something inside." She reached into the folds of her shawl and pulled out a yellowed sheet of paper, folded neatly. She placed it on the table between them, her fingers shaking slightly. Miss Marple unfolded it with care. It was a letter unfinished. "My dearest Michael, I must tell you the truth before it is too late. The night Richard died, I saw the sentence ended abruptly." Miss Marple looked up. Agnes's voice was barely above a whisper. "She never finished it." Miss Marple's thoughts spun quickly. If Eleanor had begun this letter, but never completed it, then something or someone had stopped her. And now, someone was searching for it. Miss Marple folded the paper neatly and handed it back. "You must keep this safe, Agnes." Agnes swallowed hard. "Miss Marple, do you think they'll come back?" Miss Marple gave a small, reassuring smile. "I rather suspect they might. Which is why we must be ready." The following morning, Miss Marple paid a visit to Inspector Finch. She found him pacing his small office, looking rather more agitated than usual. "You've heard, I presume," he said the moment she stepped inside. Miss Marple inclined her head. "About the break-in at Miss Willoughby's?" "Yes, I have." Finch grunted. "The poor woman was terrified. She swears she didn't see who it was." Miss Marple settled into a chair. "I suspect that was by design." Finch ran a hand through his hair. "And you say Eleanor's letter was in that sewing box?" Miss Marple nodded. "An unfinished draft of it, at least." Finch frowned. "So, whoever killed Eleanor must have known she had written something down." Miss Marple's voice was mild. "Or, at the very least, they feared she had." Finch exhaled sharply. "It always comes back to Richard Ainsley's death, doesn't it?" Miss Marple gave a slight nod. "Eleanor saw something that night, Inspector, and after all these years, she finally found the courage to speak." Finch's expression darkened. "And that's why she was murdered." Miss Marple clasped her hands. "The truth is a rather dangerous thing, Inspector." Finch's jaw tightened. "Then we need to find out exactly what Eleanor saw." Miss Marple's voice was soft but firm. "Yes, and I believe we are very close." That evening, Miss Marple took a slow walk through the village, her mind sifting through the pieces of the puzzle. The break-in at Agnes's house had not been an act of desperation. It had been calculated. Someone had taken a risk, knowing the consequences if they were discovered. And that meant one thing. The murderer was growing nervous. A shadow moved near the churchyard, and Miss Marple's keen eyes flickered toward it. Someone was standing just beyond the low stone wall. A moment later, they turned and hurried away. Miss Marple watched them go, a thoughtful expression on her face. The noose was tightening, and whoever had killed Eleanor Ainsley was beginning to feel it. Chapter 10. The Whispered Confession. Miss Marple's steps were slow but deliberate as she approached the village church the next morning. The air was crisp, with a lingering dampness from the early fog. She had spent much of the night in thought, replaying the evening's events, the break-in at Agnes's house, the discovery of Eleanor's unfinished letter, and the shadowy figure she had spotted near the churchyard. She suspected that someone, perhaps the murderer, was beginning to panic as she passed the heavy wooden doors of the church. She noticed Reverend Phelps standing near the altar, arranging hymn books. He was a mild-mannered man, his thinning gray hair combed neatly back. He turned as she entered, offering her a warm, if slightly weary, smile. "Miss Marple, what a surprise," he said, clasping his hands together. "A visit so early." Miss Marple returned the smile. "I find churches to be most calming in times of reflection, Reverend, and I dare say you've had quite the eventful few days yourself." Phelps sighed, nodding. "The whole village is uneasy, and understandably so. A break-in, a murder. It is quite dreadful." Miss Marple studied him carefully. "Tell me, Reverend, have you noticed anything unusual, particularly regarding those who come to the church?" Phelps hesitated. "Unusual." Miss Marple nodded. "Perhaps a certain visitor, someone behaving anxiously." Phelps frowned slightly, rubbing his chin. "Now that you mention it, Arthur Ellsworth was here late last night." He looked troubled. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "Troubled, you say?" Phelps nodded. "He was pacing near the confessional, deep in thought. When I asked if he was well, he merely muttered something about past scenes and hurried off." Miss Marple's gaze did not waver. "Did he say anything else?" Phelps hesitated, then sighed. "Miss Marple, I am not one to gossip, but Arthur seemed genuinely afraid." Miss Marple gave a small nod. "Then I believe it is time I speak to him." Arthur Ellsworth's cottage was a modest one, tucked away on a quiet lane near the edge of the village. Miss Marple found him in his small study, slumped in a chair, his hands trembling as he clutched a glass of whiskey. The morning light streamed through the lace curtains, highlighting the deep lines of worry on his face. He looked up as she entered, his expression wary. "Miss Marple," he muttered, "come to interrogate me, have you?" Miss Marple settled into the chair opposite him. "Not at all, dear Mr. Ellsworth. I simply wish to understand." Arthur let out a humorless chuckle. "Understand? There is nothing to understand. Eleanor is dead." "And the past," he broke off, shaking his head. "The past should have stayed buried." Miss Marple's voice was gentle but firm. "But it didn't, did it?" Arthur's hand clenched around the glass. Miss Marple's eyes softened. "Reverend Phelps told me you were at the church last night. You seemed troubled." Arthur exhaled sharply, running a hand through his disheveled hair. "I thought about confessing." Miss Marple tilted her head. "Confessing to what, Mr. Ellsworth?" Arthur swallowed hard. "To a mistake. One that changed everything." A long silence followed. Miss Marple waited patiently. At last, Arthur spoke in a hoarse whisper. "I was there the night Richard Ainsley died." Miss Marple's hands remained folded neatly in her lap. "Go on." Arthur took a shaky breath. "I didn't kill him, but I saw what happened. I saw who did." Miss Marple's expression did not change. "And you have kept this secret all these years?" Arthur gave a bitter laugh. "I had no choice. If I spoke, it would have ruined everything. And Eleanor, she must have found out." Miss Marple's voice was quiet. "That's why she was murdered." Arthur's shoulders sagged. "I should have stopped it, but I was too much of a coward." Miss Marple's gaze was unwavering. "Tell me the truth now, Mr. Ellsworth." Arthur hesitated, then whispered, "It was Robert Lockwood." A heavy silence filled the room. Miss Marple's fingers tightened slightly. "You are certain?" Arthur nodded, his eyes haunted. "I saw him arguing with Richard that night. It was heated, something about money, or debts, I don't know. Then suddenly, Richard was on the floor." Miss Marple's voice was calm, but there was steel beneath it. "And you said nothing?" Arthur exhaled shakily. "Lockwood saw me. He told me that if I kept quiet, he would ensure the matter was handled. I was young, frightened, and I believed him." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "And so the truth was buried." Arthur closed his eyes, until Eleanor started asking questions. Miss Marple's voice was quiet but firm. "You understand what this means, don't you? If Lockwood killed Richard Ainsley, and Eleanor uncovered the truth, then she was silenced for the same reason." Arthur's voice was hollow. "I should have spoken up." Miss Marple regarded him for a long moment. Then she arose. "It is not too late to do so now, Mr. Ellsworth." Arthur looked up at her, his eyes filled with guilt and something else, relief. Will you tell the inspector? He asked. Miss Marple gave him a small, knowing smile. Oh, I rather suspect he already knows. That evening, Miss Marple returned to her guest house and sat by the window, watching the fading light. The puzzle pieces were finally fitting together. Richard Ainsley had been murdered years ago. Robert Lockwood had hidden the truth, allowing Michael Garwood to take the blame. And when Eleanor Ainsley had come too close to uncovering that truth, she had been silenced. But there was still one unanswered question. If Robert Lockwood was truly the murderer, then why had someone broken into Agnes Willoughby's house in search of Eleanor's letter? Miss Marple tapped her fingers against the armrest. There was something more at play here. Something hidden just beneath the surface. And she would find it. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. She rose and opened it to find Inspector Finch standing there, his face grim. "We've just received word," he said. "Robert Lockwood is missing." Miss Marple's brows lifted slightly. "Missing?" Finch nodded. "His office was found ransacked, and there was blood on the floor." Miss Marple exhaled softly. "How very interesting." Finch's eyes narrowed. "You think someone got to him first?" Miss Marple's lips curved into the faintest of smiles. "Oh, Inspector, I rather think the murderer is beginning to panic." Finch straightened. "Then we'd best move quickly." Miss Marple nodded. "Yes, because I do believe the final act is about to begin." Chapter 11. The vanishing of Robert Lockwood. Inspector Finch's office was unusually silent. Save for the distant ticking of the clock on the mantelpiece, Miss Marple sat primly in her chair, her hands folded, her expression serene yet thoughtful. Across from her, Finch paced, his brow furrowed. "Lockwood's missing," he muttered. "And not just missing, his office was ransacked. Blood was found on the floor, and no one has seen him since last night." Miss Marple tilted her head. "Then, the question we must ask ourselves, Inspector, is whether Robert Lockwood has vanished of his own accord, or if someone has made him disappear." Finch ran a hand through his hair. "Could be either. He had a lot to lose if the truth about Richard Ainsley's murder came out." Miss Marple's gaze was steady. "Or someone else had even more to lose if Lockwood decided to talk." Finch exhaled sharply. "We need to find him, and fast." Miss Marple nodded. "Yes, because if my suspicions are correct, Mr. Lockwood may not have much time left." The village of Ravenscroft had never been one for grand excitement, but the news of Robert Lockwood's disappearance spread like wildfire. At the King's Arms, the local pub, groups of villagers murmured in hushed voices over their morning pints. In the small grocer's shop, Mrs. Pembroke, the shopkeeper, whispered conspiratorially with a customer about the ominous bloodstains found in Lockwood's office. Miss Marple, however, was not one for idle gossip. She was already on her way to speak to Agnes Willoughby. Agnes had been the last person to come into possession of Eleanor Ainsley's letter, and Miss Marple had a strong suspicion that the break-in at her house and Lockwood's disappearance were closely connected. She arrived at the Willoughby cottage to find Agnes looking even more anxious than the last time they had spoken. "Oh, Miss Marple, it's awful," she said the moment she opened the door. "Robert Lockwood, and after everything that's happened, I can't help but feel that whoever came into my house that night was looking for this." She gestured toward the folded letter on her writing desk. Miss Marple stepped inside, shutting the door gently behind her. "Have you read it in full, my dear?" Agnes hesitated, then nodded. "I did. Eleanor never finished writing it, but what she did write was enough." Miss Marple's expression remained calm. "Would you allow me to see it once more?" Agnes picked up the letter with careful fingers and handed it over. Miss Marple read it again, absorbing every word. "My dearest Michael, I must tell you the truth before it is too late. The night Richard died, I saw her sharp eyes lingered on the unfinished sentence." "She saw something," Miss Marple murmured, "something that proved Michael Garwood was innocent. And she was killed before she could say what it was." Agnes nodded. "But Miss Marple, if Robert Lockwood really was the murderer, why would someone come looking for this letter after Eleanor's death? Surely the killer would have destroyed it beforehand." Miss Marple's eyes flickered with interest. "An excellent question, my dear." She carefully folded the letter. "I do believe we have been making one very dangerous assumption." Agnes frowned. "What do you mean?" Miss Marple's voice was quiet, measured. "We assumed that Robert Lockwood was responsible for both murders, Richard Ainsley's and Eleanor's." Agnes inhaled sharply. "You mean someone else killed Eleanor?" Miss Marple gave a small nod. "Yes, and I believe that person may have just silenced Robert Lockwood as well." Miss Marple's next stop was Arthur Ellsworth's cottage. He had been the one to confess seeing Robert Lockwood on the night Richard Ainsley died, but there were still questions that needed answering. She knocked briskly on the door, and after a moment, it creaked open. Arthur stood there, looking pale and worn, his eyes darting nervously. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice hoarse. Miss Marple studied him for a long moment. "Mr. Ellsworth, may I come in?" Arthur hesitated, then stepped aside. Inside, the cottage was dimly lit, a faint trace of whiskey in the air. Arthur collapsed into a chair, rubbing a hand over his face. "I suppose you've come to ask more questions." Miss Marple smiled gently. "I do apologize if I am troubling you, but I feel we are very close to the truth." Arthur let out a bitter chuckle. Truth is a dangerous thing, Miss Marple." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Yes, and I dare say someone is rather desperate to keep it hidden." Arthur looked up sharply. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. "Tell me, Mr. Ellsworth, do you believe Robert Lockwood was the one who killed Eleanor?" Arthur's mouth opened, then closed. I don't know," he admitted. "It made sense, didn't it? He had every reason to keep her quiet." Miss Marple's voice was gentle. "And yet, now, he has vanished, and someone left blood behind in his office. Doesn't that strike you as odd?" Arthur swallowed hard. "You think someone else did it?" Miss Marple nodded. "Yes. Someone who knew that Eleanor was getting too close. Someone who also feared what Robert Lockwood might reveal if pressed." Arthur's fingers drummed anxiously against the armrest. Miss Marple studied him closely. "Mr. Ellsworth, did you tell anyone about what you saw that night?" Arthur hesitated. "No. Well, only you and Finch." Miss Marple's expression did not change. "And yet, within hours of your confession, Robert Lockwood disappears. That suggests that someone else overheard your words." Arthur's face paled. "You mean someone was listening?" Miss Marple nodded. "Yes, and that person realized they had to act quickly." Arthur's voice dropped to a whisper. "Then, we're all in danger." Miss Marple straightened. "I believe it is time we confront the real murderer." Arthur swallowed. "And who do you think it is?" Miss Marple gave him a small smile. "That, dear Mr. Ellsworth, is what I intend to prove." That evening, Miss Marple found herself once more at Inspector Finch's office. "I believe I know who the murderer is," she said without preamble. Finch's brows shot up. "Already," Miss Marple smiled faintly. "I have suspected for some time, but now the pieces fit." Finch leaned forward, and Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. "We must set a trap, Inspector, because I do believe our killer will strike one final time." Finch's jaw tightened. "You're sure?" Miss Marple gave a single nod. "Yes, and this time we shall be ready." Chapter 12. The Trappist village of Ravenscroft lay under an uneasy hush as Miss Marple and Inspector Finch finalized their plan. The fire in Finch's office crackled faintly, casting flickering shadows on the walls. Miss Marple, seated with impeccable poise, carefully folded her hands in her lap. Across from her, Finch's expression was a mixture of skepticism and intrigue. "You're certain the murderer will strike again?" Finch asked. Miss Marple nodded. "Yes, Inspector, because they must." Finch sighed, rubbing his chin. "And you believe you know who it is?" Miss Marple's voice was calm but firm. "The pieces have all fallen into place. The break-in at Agnes Willoughby's house, Eleanor Ainsley's murder, and now Robert Lockwood's disappearance. It all connects." Finch leaned forward. "Then let's hear it, Miss Marple. Who are we dealing with?" Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. "Before I answer that, tell me, Inspector, what do we know about Robert Lockwood's disappearance?" Finch frowned. His office was ransacked, blood on the floor, but no body, and no sign of a struggle outside. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Precisely, no body. Which means one of two things. Either he was taken away alive, or he staged his own disappearance." Finch tapped his fingers against the desk. "You think Lockwood is still alive, Mr. S." Marple's smile was faint. "If he were dead, I dare say the murderer would have made quite sure we found him. His body would have been displayed as a warning." Finch exhaled sharply. "Then, that means someone is keeping him hidden." "But why?" Miss Marple's voice was quiet. "Because he still knows something. Something that could unravel the entire mystery." A silence fell between them before Finch muttered, "So, what's the plan?" Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. "We shall create an opportunity for the murderer to act, one they will find impossible to resist." The plan was set in motion the very next day. Miss Marple ensured that word spread through the village that a new clue had been discovered, one that would reveal the truth about Eleanor Ainsley's murder. The rumor, carefully planted among the gossiping ladies at the grocer's shop and the regulars at the King's Arms, would soon reach the ears of the murderer. The clue, of course, was a fabrication. Marple knew the murderer was growing desperate, and desperate people made mistakes. By evening, Inspector Finch had arranged for a small gathering at the village hall, where, supposedly, the new evidence would be discussed. Among those present were Arthur Ellsworth, Agnes Willoughby, Reverend Phelps, and a handful of other villagers. The tension in the room was thick. Miss Marple sat near the front, knitting absently, while Finch stood beside her, keeping a close watch on the assembled faces. "Ladies and gentlemen," Finch announced, "as many of you have heard, we have come across new information regarding the murder of Eleanor Ainsley. It appears she was in possession of something very important before her death, something that could lead us to the truth." A murmur rippled through the small crowd. Miss Marple glanced around subtly. Her sharp eyes noted the nervous flicker in Arthur Ellsworth's gaze, the way Agnes Willoughby clasped her hands tightly together, and the small bead of sweat forming on Reverend Phelps' forehead. But it was someone else's reaction that interested her the most. In the far corner of the room sat Henry Parker, the village solicitor. A quiet, unassuming man, he had rarely been the center of attention throughout the investigation. Yet now, as Finch spoke, Miss Marple observed the subtle tightening of his jaw, the twitch in his fingers as he fidgeted with the buttons of his waistcoat. She had suspected him for some time. "Inspector," Miss Marple said pleasantly, her voice carrying through the room, "would you be so kind as to remind us exactly what was missing from Eleanor Ainsley's effects?" Finch nodded. "Her unfinished letter." Miss Marple gave a knowing smile. "Indeed, and would it not be most interesting if someone had gone to great lengths to retrieve it?" Henry Parker cleared his throat suddenly, drawing glances from those around him. Miss Marple turned her gaze toward him. "Mr. Parker, you were Eleanor Ainsley's solicitor, were you not?" Parker hesitated. "Yes, I was." Miss Marple's voice remained gentle. "And as her solicitor, you would have had access to her estate, her documents, and any private affairs she wished to keep confidential." Parker's fingers twitched. "That is correct." Miss Marple smiled. "Then I wonder, Mr. Parker, were you seen near Agnes Willoughby's cottage on the night of the break-in?" A hush fell over the room. Parker's eyes darted toward the door, but Finch had already positioned himself strategically, blocking any escape. I don't know what you mean, Parker. Stammered. Miss Marple's expression did not waver. "Oh, but I rather think you do." She set down her knitting. Eleanor Ainsley had discovered the truth about Richard Ainsley's murder, but the real murderer was not Robert Lockwood. It was you, Mr. Parker. A collective gasp filled the hall. Parker's face drained of color. "That's absurd." Miss Marple merely tilted her head. "Is it? You handled Richard Ainsley's legal affairs, did you not? You were privy to his finances, his business dealings, and most importantly, debts." Parker swallowed hard. Miss Marple's voice remained calm. "Richard Ainsley discovered that you had been embezzling money from his accounts. He confronted you about it, and in your desperation, you killed him." Parker's hands clenched. "You have no proof." Miss Marple smiled. "Ah, but Eleanor Ainsley found something, didn't she? Perhaps old records, hidden ledgers, something that proved you had stolen from her father." Parker's lips pressed together, but his silence spoke volumes. Miss Marple continued. "She must have come to you, demanding the truth, and, just like with Richard, you silenced her before she could expose you." Parker's breath was unsteady. "This is nonsense, a baseless accusation." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Then perhaps you can explain why you went to Agnes Willoughby's house looking for Eleanor's letter, or why Robert Lockwood disappeared shortly after Arthur Ellsworth revealed his suspicions." Parker's hands trembled. Inspector Finch stepped forward. "That's enough. Parker, you're coming with us." Parker's eyes darted around wildly. Then, with a sudden burst of movement, he lunged toward the door, but Finch was faster. In a swift motion, he caught Parker's arm and wrestled him back. Parker struggled for only a moment before his shoulders sagged in defeat. Miss Marple exhaled softly. "It is over, Mr. Parker." The village hall remained silent as the weight of the truth settled upon them. Parker's voice was barely a whisper. "I had no choice." Miss Marple's gaze was kind, but firm. "We always have a choice." Finch tightened his grip on Parker's arm. You'll have plenty of time to think about yours in prison. As Parker was led away, Miss Marple turned to Agnes and Arthur, who looked equally stunned. The past, she said gently, has a way of catching up with us. And with that, the mystery of Ravenscroft was finally solved. Thank you for tuning in to Mystery Unlocked. If you enjoyed the intrigue, suspense, and the thrill of the chase, don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon. Stay updated on more captivating detective adventures that will keep you at the edge of your seat. Your support makes it possible to continue bringing these stories to life. Keep the mysteries alive until next time.